So we again get a peek into Jesus's understanding of religion, Jesus's understanding of what spirituality is about. So as we saw in the introduction, the Lord's Prayer is a summary of the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus, very clearly elucidated in a very concise manner as well. And so again, this phrase, give us this day our daily bread, tells us about Jesus's intentions and Jesus's aspirations for this world.
God,
So,
something's wrong with my net.
yeah. So when we look at the religion that Jesus professed, or the religion that Jesus was interested in, so Jesus had this kind of life that he advocated, where the spiritual and the physical were not at loggerheads with each other. The physical was very much part of the spiritual, and there was no compartmentalization. So these are the spiritual aspects of one's life, and these are the physical aspects of one's life. So more than that, we see a kind of integration. We see that the physical is very much part of the spiritual, and the spiritual again encompasses all the different realms of a human being's existence. So to begin with, we see that Jesus believed in a spirituality that was not indifferent to the physical, but a spirituality that affirmed the physical needs, a spirituality that affirmed the requirements for every human being to live. And it is in this context that food becomes a very important feature in Jesus' life and ministry. When you look at Jesus' life as it is recorded in the Gospels, Jesus places a lot of emphasis on fellowship. And this fellowship is very much seen in context of meals. Jesus is dining with a lot of people. And sometimes when you look at the people who are dining along with him, the moral police of his times were very much upset with Jesus' association with people who were of a suspect moral standing, people who were the so-called sinners. And in that context, again, we see that Jesus was always involved in fellowship, in communing with other people. And this communion very often was in the context of a meal. And these meals are very important. The food is very important. And again, when we look at bread in particular, when we look at food in general or meals in general, there are many examples. But when we look at bread in particular, we can always see the first temptation that Jesus had to endure, the temptation where the evil one or the wicked one tells Jesus, why don't you convert these stones into bread so that you may eat of it and your hunger will vanish. But Jesus again responds to that by quoting a verse from Deuteronomy, where he says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of the Lord. Again, when you look at the context of that particular verse, it is a verse which is spoken to people who have very recently inherited the promised land, and there is a call to them to not forget God when they are encountered with a great abundance, when they're encountered with prosperity. So, in that context, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the Lord. So, Jesus encounters the wicked one by saying that word. And again, we see that feeding of the multitude, more than 5,000 people. And this feeding miracle is so very important that all the four gospel writers make a mention of it. Because when you look at certain gospel, when you look at certain miracle stories, they could be found in a few gospels and not in all. But here you have one miracle which is found in all the four gospels. And again, it is about providing food or providing bread in particular to people who are famished. And again, after Jesus' resurrection, the risen Christ accompanies a couple of his disciples to Emmaus, and during that journey, Jesus actually breaks bread, and during the breaking of the bread, the identity of Jesus is revealed to the other two disciples. So food, and in particular bread, being very important in Jesus' life, his ministry, and even after his resurrection. So in this context, when we look at this particular phrase or this statement, give us this day our daily bread, I would like to focus on the word give, asking God to give to us. I think that's a very courageous word if it is told with a lot of integrity and honesty. When we look at God or others and say give, it means that we are making ourselves vulnerable. Because we live in a culture where we do not want to be dependent on anyone. We always talk about independence. Independence where we are not dependent on anyone and I can provide for myself. I am sufficient by myself. But Christian spirituality is not about independence. Christian spirituality is about interdependence. How we depend on God and how we depend on each other. So when I look at this word give, it means that we are making ourselves vulnerable, we are opening ourselves, we are acknowledging our need, and we are also saying that we are dependent on God. And that is a very strong, courageous faith statement to say that we cannot do it all by ourselves, but we are dependent on somebody else. Maybe the greater power who nourishes us and nurtures us. And that I see is very important in this particular scenario. Because the kind of culture that we find ourselves in, again, makes us to believe in ourselves alone. Believe in your might, believe in your strength, believe in your skills, and you can achieve everything by yourself. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has shattered that confidence. Prior to that, there was this big confidence all over the world that human beings can do everything by themselves. They have found out the secrets to everything and they have worked out answers to all the problems. So there is no problem bigger than the human being. But this pandemic has confronted us with our insecurities, with our vulnerabilities, with our inefficiencies, insufficiencies. And it is indeed a very big spiritual struggle that we encounter as we journey through this time of the pandemic. So, in this context, to say that I require, I need, I am in need, requires a lot of courage. And that is the reason I place a lot of emphasis on this word give. Even again, when we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8, there God again reminds the people of Israel, it is not by your might, it is not by the strength of your hand that you have attained this land. The prosperity that you see around you, all the abundance that you are enjoying is not the work of your hands, but it is the gift of God. So do not take a lot of pride in yourself, but rather acknowledge that there is somebody bigger than you who will provide for you. And that again is important. And we see another example of that maybe in the parable of the rich fool, the parable of the rich man, which we see in the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 12. There is this rich man who has a big harvest and he has a lot of grains and he's not able to accommodate or store all these grains in his barns. So then he thinks of pulling down his barns and building bigger barns and storing all the grains that he has harvested. And in that context, he's so very much full of himself that he thinks only about himself and he thinks that I have enough for myself. I have stored for many more years. I'm just going to relax. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. You should look at this parable a little later. And when you look at that parable, the words I, me, myself appear many times. It's a very short passage. But in that short passage, the words I, me appear so many times. And again, it is a context where a man believes more in himself and acknowledges his ability, his skills, his wisdom more than anything else. Because for him to have a good harvest, he certainly required the land to be really blessed by God, and he also needed people to till the land. But when he has this great harvest, he forgets the people who had labored for him, and he also forgets God who has sent the rain. And it is in that context that God does not appreciate him. Maybe if we saw a person like this who has made a fortune for himself, who has so much wealth that he can relax and he can store up goods for many generations to come, we would call that man as a very wise man. We would say that he is like a very successful entrepreneur. He is a very successful man. But on the contrary, we see in this parable that God addresses this man as fool. You fool. So God addresses him in a very different manner. I think this is the only parable uttered by Jesus where God is speaking in the first person. God is actually speaking in a parable. And God uses a word which Jesus says you should not be using. When Jesus advises his disciples or followers, he says, do not call your brother a fool. Do not abuse anybody. But here we see God actually calling this man as a fool. And why is he foolish? He is foolish because he believes more in himself than in anybody else. And he's so full of himself. He's a man without gratitude. He's a man who does not acknowledge the role or contribution of others in his life. And it is for that reason that this man is called as a fool. It is very good to plan for the future. It is wise investment as well. But at the same time, we should be freed from this wrong anxiety and also a kind of wrong sense of security that we have, where we think that our goods, our abilities can provide for ourselves. So it is in this context that when Jesus says give, this word give is so very important. To say give means that we believe in somebody greater than us. To say give means that we are dependent on somebody else. And to say give, it also means that we are very vulnerable and we are open to other people's roles in our lives. So I think that word is very important. Secondly, when you look at this, when you look at this phrase, give us this day daily bread, it again is a very important challenge to all of us living in a world of greed. We live in a world of greed where it's always about the more the merrier. The kind of consumerism that we see makes us always feel sad about ourselves. We don't have a big house, we don't have a big car, we are not beautiful enough, we are not healthy enough, we are not smart enough. So the advertisements that we see on television also constantly make us feel very sad about ourselves. And once when we feel sad about ourselves, they present a product which will prove to be a solution for all the discontent that we may experience. And that product will be the magical answer to all our problems. So there is this great feeling of discontentment. And on the other hand, there is also a kind of process where our desires are multiplied. Our desires are multiplied. We are asked not to be satisfied with what we have, but we are always asked to crave for more. So we find ourselves in this kind of culture where greed is so very much prevalent in everything that we do. It is so much a part of our life. It reminds me of that story that I heard when I was a little boy about this dog who finds a juicy bone, and the dog is so very excited. The dog is so very happy that he runs with this juicy bone all over the place. And then he has to cross a stream, he has to cross a river. And when he's crossing the river, while he's traveling along the bridge, the dog sees a reflection of himself in the water. And then the dog feels that there is another dog with another bone, and that bone seems to be more juicy, that bone seems to be more appealing. So the dog jumps into the river so that it may grab that bone as well. And you can decipher, you can find out what happened after that. So this is symbolic of the kind of lives that we are leading as well. We're always so very greedy. We're always looking out for something more and more and more. And it is in this context that Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread. Very, very, very simple. very basic. Jesus is not asking us to ask for luxuries, not asking us to plead for the bread which we can store for years and years, but rather something which is minimal, something which is nourishing, and something which can be sufficient for us. And it is for this reason that we need to get over the sense of greed that the world around us promotes. I think many years ago there was a very interesting Hollywood movie, and that movie was called Wall Street. And in that movie, there is a very famous speech being made by one of the primary characters, or even the protagonist, I guess. And in that speech, the character would say that greed is good. Greed is good. This was several years ago, maybe a couple of decades ago. But when you look at today's times, greed is not only good, greed is God. So in this situation, how do we have a sense of contentment? How can we be satisfied? That is very important for us. When you look at the story of the manna in the desert, we see that God provides for his people by raining down food from the sky. And the very important lesson that we learn from that experience is the one who stored more, or the one who gathered more, did not have much. And the one who gathered little did not have a lack of anything. So God is continuing to provide, and it is not about how you accumulate, hoard at the expense of the other, which will determine your living. But instead, it is about how you can be content with whatever God provides. And this is a very important lesson for all of us. And that is the reason the prophet Isaiah also says, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. God speaking and telling us that your ways and my ways are in contradiction with each other. Your thoughts and my thoughts are in contradiction with each other. So how do we kind of try to make sense of the two different worlds that we live in? A world in which greed is considered to be good, and the world that Jesus envisions, the world in which greed can be bad and greed can also be idolatrous. When you look at Paul's letter to the Colossians, when you look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, greed is considered as idolatry. So greed as something bad and greed as something which is idolatrous as well. So in this context, this particular phrase also reminds us and challenges us to be content with what we have. Finally, one more point before I conclude. We also, when we look at this phrase, give us this day our daily bread, we see that it's something to be told, not by an individual, but by a group of people. It is not in the singular, but it is in the plural. It is not about God, give me, but it is God, give us our daily bread, not God, give me my daily bread. God, give us our daily bread. So there is a kind of identification with the others, and also an expression of concern towards the other. Because again, when we look at the kind of culture that we find ourselves in, it is a culture of indifference, apathy. Do not be bothered about the other. Do not be bothered about the other. Self interest is primary, self autonomy is primary. So don't even have time to think about the other. So when we live in a world like this, how can we identify ourselves with the needs of the other people? And how can we also be channels of blessings to the people around us? So in this context, it is very important to understand the pluralistic language in this particular phrase. Give us today our daily bread. And we say this particular phrase in unison with millions of people across the world, with people struggling because of debts, struggling because of lack of food, living in the midst of famines, living in drought affected areas. So when we say this prayer along with all of them, there is a challenge for us to, even for a small portion, sympathize or more importantly, empathize with their sufferings. And that is what this particular phrase invites us to. You might remember this story about a very accomplished photographer from South Africa who won the Pulitzer Prize maybe a couple of decades ago, a man by the name Kevin Carter. And you might remember the famous photograph of his, which actually earned him that Pulitzer Prize. It was a picture of the vulture and the little girl. When you kind of Google the vulture and the little girl, you certainly see that picture. It is about a very young girl, completely starving and almost on the verge of dying, lying almost motionless in a place, and there is a vulture right behind this young girl, waiting to swoop on the little child once she dies. So this picture was very moving. It opened the eyes of the world, and many people were able to understand the agony of the famine. They were able to empathize, and they were able to contribute towards it as well. But the kind of impact that it made on this man, along with several other bad experiences that he had when he was involved in his mission of photography, and ultimately it led to his suicide a few months later after winning the prize. The kind of impact that it made on him, the way he was so troubled after looking at that picture. So, my dear friends, when we say, "Give us this day our daily bread," and when we say this phrase along with so many other people in need, do we really feel, are we really sensitive about their needs? So this is something which we have to really think about. And I mean, initially there was this there was a couple of comments made by Jude as well as Marcus about whether it's physical nourishment or whether it is also about spiritual nourishment. I think I already answered that a little earlier by saying that the physical is very much part of the spiritual. And in Jesus's understanding of this world, Jesus's understanding of spirituality, there is no compartmentalization. There is no compartmentalization. And it is for that reason that we need to understand that the material is very much part of the spiritual. And the material needs are very much part of the spiritual quest as well. If you remember that famous slogan of the Salvation Army, the Salvation Army had a very famous slogan. They would say soap, soup, and salvation, I guess. I hope I got that in right order. Soap, soup, and salvation. Firstly about hygiene, and then about food, and then about salvation. But again, this is not something which is linear, but soap, soup, and salvation are something which are interconnected with each other. So the ultimate liberation of any human being is holistic, and it comprises both the physical as well as the spiritual. And that is important for our understanding today. And before I conclude, I would just like to remind you about a kind of a debate that continued for several years about a particular word in this phrase. So the word that we usually say, daily bread, give us this day our daily bread. The word daily, and again, it comes from a Greek word, epiosis or epiosios, which is a very rare word. Earlier, when people were referring to this word, the Greek word, they were not able to find this particular Greek word in any other ancient Greek literature. In any Greek literature. So many people contended that Matthew actually invented this word. So it's Matthew's own baby, Matthew's own creation. And after some time, they were also able to understand that there is something more significant in this word. So when Matthew says, "Give us this day our daily bread," it does not mean give us this day our bread or give us this day our daily bread, but it actually means give us our bread for tomorrow. So this is one more important translation which some scholars came up with, the bread for tomorrow. People very important like Jerome, who lived during the 4th and the 5th century AD, and who was actually instrumental in translating the Bible into Latin, the Bible which we call as the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible, Jerome would also go with this kind of understanding that Jesus is actually saying, give us the bread for tomorrow. And the understanding there would be about not only the bread that we require for our physical sustenance, for our nourishment on a daily basis, but the bread which is actually symbolic of the heavenly banquet. Whenever we participate in the Eucharist, we always say that we remember the death of Christ, we celebrate his resurrection, and we also await his coming again. So there is an anticipation, there is the hope of a banquet that God will provide for us. And the Eucharist is seen as a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. And again, this bread can also be seen as a foretaste of the food that God will provide to everybody at the culmination of time. And that is something which many scholars agree with as well. But again, when Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread, we need to remember that Jesus's audience is a group or a crowd of people who are very much marginalized. Even last week, when we were discussing about the earlier petition, we saw that Jesus was actually working from Galilee. He made his home in Capernaum, and he began his ministry in the regions of Galilee. And Galilee was home to the destitute, the home to the daily wage laborers, home to fishermen, home to very simple people, home to people living on the fringes, on the margins of society, who are not very much affluent. So when Jesus joins with a community of people who are economically deprived and says, give us this day our daily bread, it certainly means that Jesus is identifying with the needs of these people for whom even the bread for that particular day was not assured. It was not about people who had their refrigerators full with food. It was not about people with lots of money in their bank. But these were people who were suffering. These were people who were living in the shadow of death. And for them, everyday food itself was very elusive. And it is in this context that Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread. So, my dear friends, the material very much part of the spiritual, and there is no dichotomy between the material and the spiritual. That is what Jesus professes, advocates throughout his life. And in today's petition, Jesus speaks about the most essential need for every human being, food. And what food is symbolic of, and what we actually say when we utter those words, give us this day our daily bread. So I wish to conclude with this.